Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar about increasing diversity in European clinical trials, hosted jointly by Greenfire, a leading provider in clinical trial and research solutions, and EUPATI, the European Patients Academy for Therapeutic Innovation. We have a very interesting lineup for you today. First of all, my name is Tamás Beretsky, and I work with the European Patients Therapeutic Innovation, EUPATI, where I'm responsible for contents and courses. You will meet today three experts from our speaker panel, Angela, Ingrid, and Ian, who will discuss diversity, the importance and possibilities for diversity in clinical research, and also some ethical perspectives and considerations of that. If you have any questions, those are very welcome. And in that case, please click on the questions and answers box and enter your questions there, so we get a quick notification here, and we will come back to your questions at the end of the session after the presentations. So that's why we recommend that you enter your questions there. And also, of course, we have set aside time for you to raise those issues, raise those questions. This is a tremendously exciting topic that has been a major concern for researchers, clinicians, regulators, and patient communities alike. And that's why we welcome this possibility so much on behalf of EUPATI, but also on behalf of Greenfire. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Ingrid Klingmann. Please, Ingrid, before you go ahead with the presentation, also introduce yourself just very quickly so that the participants know who you are, what you do.
Yeah, my name is Ingrid Klingmann. I'm a physician, originally a general practitioner, but many years ago I decided to join clinical research, pharmaceutical medicine or medicines development from a clinical perspective. So I was involved in many different clinical trials in many different areas of indications at different stages of the development process. But from the beginning, having made the switch from the GP side to the researcher side, I realized that there are really important ethical dilemmas in clinical research. And so all my career on the methodological side has always been accompanied by the ethical considerations and improvements, seeking solutions for ethical considerations and aspects. And in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years, the patient perspective and the patient view have become a primary focus on what I'm thinking, doing, and how I try to bring the things together. And therefore, this topic today of diversity in clinical trials from the perspective of ethics and science is really core to my heart because it leads us to the fundaments of the clinical research issues. So when we talk about diversity, as you can see already on my cover slide here, that means diversity can mean many different things, from race to ethnicity to sex to gender to age. There are many different ways how the patient population is different, and that we have to take this into consideration. Now, I'm fully aware that there is a really important discussion ongoing about improving diversity in clinical trials. There are many very important good reasons to do so, but let's try to understand why we have here a dilemma and what could be done about that. Let's be clear about the aims of medicines development. When we have a compound that comes out of preclinical, and we have learned in the toxicology studies that the drug seems to be, or the substance seems to be safe enough to go into human development, then we have this opportunity to have a new treatment option for our patients. And then the aim of the clinical researcher is to demonstrate this new substance's efficacy as quickly as possible according to statistical reliability concepts, because we need to really prove with statistical significance that the new drug is working according to the expectations. So we want to show that the drug is reliably doing what it is supposed to do. So we call that also generate evidence. We want to understand reliably the optimally efficient dose and the dosing scheme. We want to investigate also the side effect spectrum and the conditions for side effects, the risks of occurrence. So it's efficacy and safety that we need to really understand well before we can submit a dossier to the competent authorities requesting marketing authorization. So that means we want to achieve enough data as quickly as possible that can convince the regulatory authorities of the efficacy and the positive benefit risk balance to achieve marketing authorizations, because that is what competent authorities are doing. And I think we all know very much that EMA is again looking into this benefit risk balance today concerning the AstraZeneca vaccine. So this benefit risk balance and convincing the competent authorities that the data that we have generated are able to show this, that is what we want to do as quickly as possible, because we want to make that new treatment or this new drug accessible to patients so that they can get it from the pharmacy all over the world, if ever possible, as early as possible. Now, there are many different ways to generate this optimally convincing data package. And because there are so many different options, because it is so complex, there is there are a lot of moments where we have to think about balancing the benefits and risks for the study participants, but also for the success chances of the development plan. We want to make sure that the risk of failure gets reduced as much as possible. And of course, we need to consider the needs of the patients at large. And you are probably familiar with this type of presentation of the medicine's development process. We have the so-called explorative development, that is the animal work, the preclinical work, and the trials in what we call phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 is the healthy volunteer studies, and phase 2 is the dose-finding studies. And then we have this confirmation phase. That is where we perform the very large clinical trials to demonstrate under statistically significant conditions that the drug is efficiently working and that the safety profile is acceptable. Then comes the marketing authorization process. And after marketing authorization, we have again a number of clinical trials that are either organized by the sponsor, by the pharma company, on the company's own decision for information collection on additional aspects, or they are requested by competent authorities as part of the marketing authorization. Now, we have, as I mentioned already, several moral dilemmas of clinical research. First of all, we need to be clear that we cannot develop a new treatment nowadays without exposing human beings to the research situation, to the test situation. And this means that these human beings, these patients, it is not the purpose to treat them in an optimal way, but it is their enrollment in the trial is for the purpose of generating data, generating information. We try very hard to make sure that the patients also benefit from participating in the trial, but that is a second effect, so to say. So the patients involved in a trial are the means to developing useful knowledge, and therefore they are at a risk of exploitation. The other big dilemma that we have is that we need standardization, maximum standardization of the trial participant population and of the study conditions, because the variability in our data that we are generating comes from the diversity of the study participants and the diversity in the study conditions. If we can reduce those two aspects, then we can identify a true difference of effects between two treatments with the smallest number of enrolled subjects. And that is what we want to achieve, because that will help us to reduce the trial duration. It goes faster. We have a smaller study to do with less subjects, and that's therefore also the costs. It helps to reduce overall the drug development time and costs, and it enhances the chance to demonstrate efficacy. With the less variability we have in our data, the better is the chance that we can show that this drug is having the effect that we were expecting in comparison to the other drug or to placebo. And very importantly, we can keep the number of patients that we expose to the risk of an investigational drug to a minimum. On the other hand, this means that we generate data in a very narrowly selected patient population and under very defined artificial study conditions. And we also deprive patients, other patients, or a larger group of patients from getting access to this trial if that is a trial with, let's say, a new or unique treatment option that would otherwise not be available. I don't want to go into the special situation of personalized medicine or genetically defined treatments where we really, by definition, develop the drug for a very, very specifically defined patient population, and only those are then get involved. It makes sense to involve those into a clinical trial. Now, the consequences of such a development strategy are manifold. On one hand, it means that we generate information mostly in white men between 18 and 65 years, because we don't have men and women, or we have, let's say, in Europe also mostly white people, and therefore it's easier to get them. So de facto, we have mostly white men between 18 and 65 years of age. Ideally without concomitant diseases and without concomitant medication. And from a methodological point of view, we calculate the number of patients per study arm that we need based on the primary research question that we want to answer with this study. That means that we can, with this overall number of participants included in the clinical development program, only get also a limited amount of information concerning the safety. The more we reduce the number of people that we include, the more we reduce the chance to see side effects early. Now, we can identify and we can define upfront already that we want to identify certain subpopulations in our clinical trial. So if we have men and women of different age groups, we can say we want to specifically look into women between 18 and 25, for example. So we can define that upfront. But the subpopulations that we are defining this way and that we are recruiting are usually then smaller groups, and our statistical concepts, they are too small to show results or statistical significance of the results that we are seeing. So the subpopulations are not statistically powered, so we do not have the same level of evidence as for the big population. That means we cannot really rely on the information that we collect in those subpopulations during those clinical trials. And it also means that, yes, we can achieve in this way that we have the fastest possible access to the trial, to this new drug, but it is in fact for the standard patient population of white people between 18 and 65 years. Now, this aim of a fastest possible access to markets in a standardized patient population can therefore really be beneficial for coming to the market as quickly as possible. And that's also supported by marketing authorization procedure that we are seeing more and more, and also these days in the COVID-19 approach, called conditional approval. Going through such a conditional approval means that there is a marketing authorization with a very limited number of trials and therefore a limited number of patients on which we have research results. But there is a commitment from the pharma company to do more trials after marketing authorization in a systematic way and to share those results with the competent authorities ongoingly. The advantage of having such a very fast access to the market is that physicians can then decide to prescribe the new drug not only to this authorized group, but also to minority groups that were not represented in the trial, because they can have make the medical judgment that it's acceptable to prescribe this treatment, this new treatment off-label, so to say, to a patient population that has not been investigated in the clinical trials. And this systematic information collection after marketing authorization can also be requested not only under conditional approval conditions, but also for all other type of approval systems in so-called post-authorization efficacy studies or post-authorization safety studies. And for the children's population, we have anyway an ongoing request and process to establish efficacy and safety of the new treatment or the new drug in children. And this comes from the pediatric regulation based on a pediatric investigation plan and an obligation for every sponsor who develops a new drug. However, when we expose patients or when the physician decides to give this off-label or this new medication off-label, this means that these patient populations are already quite often vulnerable. And this means that the physician exposes them to additional risk and burden of receiving a new treatment that has not been really investigated for them. And it may also mean that a lot of people are not aware that there is a new treatment, or they are aware, but the reimbursement system is not covering the costs, because the reimbursement systems usually only cover costs for formally authorized treatments. So there is also a disparity here and unfairness potential of big size. And again, if the trial, and especially the big trial at the end, is a unique opportunity for access to a treatment that would otherwise not be available, then these vulnerable populations who are not in the core group of the investigated populations have again a disadvantage, because they do not get this chance of access to such a treatment. So we have possible solutions. One is that we try within the clinical trial to increase the diversity of the patient population. That may increase the risk for successful demonstration of efficacy and safety of the new drug. So we may not be able to show really efficacy because the diversity is too big. But it will give the same level of knowledge for a broader scope of patients from the beginning, but it will also expose more vulnerable patients to the risks and burden of research if we include them into this research setting. Another possibility would be that we perform more trials, so special trials in these subpopulations, in these more vulnerable populations. And as you can imagine, that will increase the cost, the complexity, and the duration of the overall clinical development program. But again, we will get a larger scope of knowledge for a broader patient population and group. But again, it exposes more vulnerable patients to the risks and burden of research even if we create or prepare a trial just for them. Now, what can we do to overcome those dilemmas? One very important solution is to engage patients in the clinical development process and in the clinical trial planning, so that there is a better understanding of the need for diversity in the participant populations. And patients living with a disease, having experience in the medicine's development process from that perspective, can give here very important ideas and suggestions on how to find the right balance here between standardization and diversity. There can also be an awareness that there's a need for systematic planning and supervision of enabling the diversity from the trial design all through the trial performance. We have new technologies like modeling and simulation where we can, with available data, expand, so to say, the knowledge that we have about a drug through these modeling and simulation technology, and also more and more coming the tools of artificial intelligence. We can also, and there are also big developments ongoing, improve the conditions for exploiting real-world data of patients who get access to that treatment in after-marketing authorization, for example. And we can also, and that is also happening, and especially now during COVID, we made a quantum leap. We have more and more opportunities to facilitate the participation for patients in clinical trials, and in this way also make it easier for vulnerable populations to participate in a clinical trial, and therefore reduce that additional burden to some degree. Now, when we do clinical research, we have to understand 4 ethical principles. First of all, there is the respect of autonomy for the study participant. There is the physician's obligation for non-maleficence, do no harm, to do beneficence, and to enable justice, so fair access to treatment options, and an equal risk and burden distribution for all involved. That is also supported by the Declaration of Helsinki that gives ethical advice and guidance on what a physician has to do when he does normal clinical care and clinical research, and how he has to balance that. And ultimately, what has to be ensured is that medical research involving human subjects may only be conducted if the importance of the objective for that research outweighs the inherent risks and burdens to the research subjects. So it must really be worthwhile that we do that study, and we need to protect the patients in the trial, and we need to make sure that the data that we are generating are so reliable that we can make new treatment recommendations with full confidence based on evidence. So that means we cannot simply require more diversity in clinical research. We have to figure out when exactly we try to improve this topic diversity in the most acceptable way. And this is different from drug to drug, what type of drug that is, what area of indication. Also, is it genetical diversity, or is it societal, like age, sex, etc.? What are the population definitions? We need also to think about the stage of the clinical development in which we want to have larger patient diversity. We need to think about the vulnerability of the patient populations for the risks in clinical trials and the expected benefits, but also think about the availability of treatment alternatives when we have to balance all these different aspects. So with my last slide, I want to make a plea that when we think about increasing diversity, that we do not really discuss this topic in phase 1 trials, where in healthy volunteers, we really just try to understand what happens when the drug gets into the body from a metabolization point of view. We want to also think about phase 2, the dose finding situation, where we work in very small populations, where we need to understand what are the different doses doing. The real area where we should and can think about diversity is the large phase 3 trials, and then the aftermarket authorization trials, phase 4. These are the areas where we should and can and must think about diversity and the right balance between all these different dilemmas. Thank you very much. So, Ian, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, Thank you, Ingrid. Brilliant as always. Ian will introduce us to the patient perspective coming from a large patient organization in Europe, my original home organization as well, from many years before. Ian, take it away, and also please introduce yourself quickly.
Thanks so much, Thomas, and thank you to EUPATI for inviting me to present in this exciting webinar. And thanks, Ingrid, for laying some of the basic principles which I think are important to consider. So what I'm going to talk about over the next few minutes, as you can see, is diversity in clinical trials from the perspective of a patient organisation. My name's Ian Hodgson. I'm a member of the European AIDS Treatment Group and currently on the board of directors. And the European AIDS Treatment Group, as you can see from this blurb, is a patient-led NGO that advocates for the rights and interests of people living with or affected with HIV and related co-infections within the European WHO region. EATG was founded in 1992 and currently represents the diversity of more than 2.3 million people living with HIV across Europe, as well as those affected by HIV and co-infections. So, of course, you can see from EATG's perspective, it's very important that we know that data that is presented about medications and drugs do actually represent the people who might be taking them at the end, and therefore EATG is involved in advocacy around diversity for clinical trials. So for the next few minutes, and I will keep to time, I'm going to talk about these 5 things, and I hope they're relevant to you, and certainly they do build up on what Ingrid has already said. I want to talk briefly around why diversity in clinical trials is needed, what's really happening in the real world, what's the role of scientists in increasing diversity, what's the role of community-based organisations in increasing diversity, and finally just some recommendations to take away from this. Just to share some opening thoughts, I think one of the issues around clinical trials, of course, is selection. And selection and recruitment of communities and people for participation must be fair. And I think we got that from Ingrid's interesting presentation. But it also should create a research climate that shows respect for all people. And I think that's really important. Secondly, with regard to ethnicity, which again Ingrid touched on, we do know that race and ethnicity does affect how people respond to drugs. But the evidence all shows that at the moment, clinical trials are disproportionately white, and therefore there are limited data on what drugs actually do for people who aren't white. And this does affect minority groups, not just with HIV, but also with hypertension and cancer, for example. With regard to women, and this is a quote I've lifted from this excellent book, I do recommend you reading, Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez, which focuses on gender and the skewing of data generally and the bias towards the male gender, but also it's very good at showing how the selection of data can skew a worldview. And she says this: seeing man as the human default is fundamental to the structure of human society. It's an old habit that runs deep. The presumption that what is male is universal is a direct consequence of the gender data gap. And this certainly is reflected in research. And in this text, she does go quite deeply into how the data and information we have about lots of things is skewed from a gender basis and therefore doesn't really tell us much about, in this case, anybody who isn't of the male gender. So why is diversity important in clinical trials? Well, firstly, many factors can influence how a person reacts to a drug. As Ingrid pointed out, this can be age, gender, and ethnic background, and other issues as well can also affect how a person responds. And there does tend to be a lack of diversity in clinical trials, and this is a moral, scientific, and medical issue, because when trial participants are homogenous, so of a certain ethnic group, or of a certain age, or of a certain gender, the findings will be skewed and they won't be generalizable. So in a sense, they don't tell us really very much about any other groups. And certainly this is the case in the HIV sector, where for many, many years, much of the data we had on antiretroviral treatments for people living with HIV was basically done on men. So we had very little information about how this affected women. And thirdly, one fact, 1/5 of new drugs approved between 2018 and 2013 showed racial differences in drug response that were in some cases significant enough to impact prescribing decisions. So even at the end of the line, when something had gone through the approvals process, changes will still have to be made at the clinical level because there was no data about this drug on this particular person's group. So what's happening in the real world? Well, I've already alluded to it, and Ingrid did as well. Women are excluded largely from many studies, clinical trials, and safety data for these groups are insufficient or delayed. So we still don't have a lot of information about how drugs affect women with regard to many medications. Non-white populations are also often excluded, and in the case of HIV treatments, these trials are overwhelmingly conducted in richer countries with white men who are massively over-recruited. Thirdly, even when you look broadly at the samples that make up trials for research into HIV treatments, these don't represent the global picture of people living with HIV, again, because of the gender skew and also the ethnicity skew. So therefore, the data we have doesn't tell us some things about quite a few people. And fourthly, another issue we're also seeing is that people living with HIV are excluded from studies into other drugs, which may affect them. For example, studies looking at new cancer treatments normally exclude people living with HIV, even though because people are living much longer with HIV now, because of effective HIV treatments, they're now experiencing various cancers, which they might not have had previously. But there is very limited data about how these drugs, cancer drugs, may affect somebody already living with HIV. And these are some of the barriers to why there is not broader participation in clinical trials. And Ingrid has mentioned some of these, but they include, as you can see, low income. Somebody may not be able to afford to travel to a place to take part in a trial. There may be some bias in selection. There may be a lack of awareness of decision makers in the need to make sure there's a diverse sample who are recruited to the trial. Sometimes the investigators or the doctors may not be particularly interested in hearing the patient's voice and having a broad representation in their clinical trial. There may be distrust of medicine generally, and this is something which we're seeing in responses from some groups in the vaccine for COVID-19 or the coronavirus, which leads to COVID-19 within certain ethnic groups. Certainly in the UK, there is much more distrust of having the vaccine, and that distrust applies to many other groups as well, generally towards medicine. There may be limited health and research literacy in some patient groups who may, in theory, want to be involved in trials, but just don't know much about the whole process and how to get involved. And lastly, there might be a lack of access to transportation. Somebody might not simply be able to get to a place where a trial is being undertaken. So what are the solutions? Well, from the perspective of the scientists and their need to increase diversity, there's firstly a need to increase the patient voice. So how can, during the planning process, patient organisations and patients be involved in the planning process? And at this stage, it's so important when planning trials to find out what issues are particularly important to the patients. What are they experiencing, which should be reflected in the clinical trial? Secondly, site locations. Where can you do the trials? The trials should ideally be undertaken in areas where it's easy to get a much more diverse representation who are selected, and also with staff who are working as part of the trial, able to communicate effectively and subtly with people from lots of different cultures and backgrounds. Fourthly, there may be things like specifics, providing a crèche for partners or mothers or parents to be able to leave their children while they may be doing things on the trial. And lastly, forming community partnerships is a key priority, and certainly something that the European AIDS Treatment Group is very strong on promoting, which is making sure that there is close engagement between patient organisations and people running clinical trials, and that people running clinical trials are aware of what patient groups can actually offer to the planning and implementation of a trial. What's the role of community-based organisations in increasing diversity? Well, firstly, they should be able to increase their expertise in what a clinical trial is all about and what they may be able to offer. From the EATG's perspective, in our long-term strategy, there is one specific aim, which is to meaningfully engage the diversity of people living with HIV in clinical research, priority setting, guideline development and design, implementation and evaluation. So we have it front and centre that we want as many people and patient organisations as possible involved in clinical trials at all stages. And during the last year, EATG reviewed 14 protocols as part of this process, most of which were full clinical trials, and all the reviewers were EATG members. Community-based organisations can also promote ongoing dialogue between patient organisations and industry. And EATG, until quite recently, annually led a meeting at Sitka's hepatitis C meeting, which brought in regulators, pharma, and also patient organisations, and they have been able to successfully changed some of the mandatory inclusions in trials for hepatitis C medication to include people who may be co-infected with HIV. So advocacy and engagement can bear positive results. But finally, in some regions, particularly Eastern Europe and Central Asia, patient organisations are hardly involved at all. And this is partly because of the health system and its quite hierarchical and patriarchal structure. So what can be done in these areas to try and improve the contribution of patient organisations to the planning and implementation of trials? So just to finish with 5 recommendations coming out of this about what community organisations can do. Firstly, there must be a combination of measures to ensure diversity, to broaden the diversity of trials, things like seeking demographic quotas to mirror target populations, involvement in research or investments in research facilities which are closer to underrepresented communities, and greater physical awareness could all improve diversity in clinical trials. And of course, trials must include a wider range of other groups usually excluded, such as women, people who are over 65, the ageing population of people living with HIV, and also all ethnic groups. Organisations of people living with HIV must be engaged at all levels. This is so important because the patient's voice is vital to what is, at the end of the day, going to produce data which is going to refer directly back to them as to how effective or not a medication may be and how safe or not a medication may be. So this is vitally important. Thirdly, barriers to patient involvement must be removed. We've talked about some of those already. But also innovations leveraged in study design, and this again is where the contribution of patient groups can be so expensive. Fourthly, research infrastructures must be strengthened with an emphasis on global collaborations and multisectoral partnerships. Partnership and collaboration is the key to ensuring diversity in clinical trials. And again, this will meet one of the key aims of patient organisations, which must be to make sure the data about a drug represents the whole range of people who may be affected by a particular disease and not just one particular group. And finally, it is important not just in clinical trials but in research overall, but in clinical trials particularly, we should seek patient-reported outcomes. So this is how we learn more about the individual patient experiences. So rather than something described by someone else, so what actually has been the person's experience during the trial, but also in other types of research as well. And by finding out much more about the patient experience, it provides a rich, deeper understanding of the patient experience, but also ensures better involvement of all patient groups and individuals. So thanks so much for your attention in this presentation. And I'm happy to take questions later on, but I'd like to hand over to Angela now for the next presentation.
Super. Thank you very much, Ian. Yeah, I'll just briefly introduce myself. My name's Angela Laronde. I'm a relationship director based over in the UK, and I work at Greenfire. Greenfire is a technology company that specialises in improving patient experience in clinical trials through expense reimbursement and travel coordination. And my slides today are really talking about, from our perspective, working with the clients that we work with. That could be the large pharmaceutical company to a very small biotech company, and trying to explain a little bit about what we hear. We're looking at diversity through the lens in these slides, through the lens of inclusion. And I heard Ian mention there about people being excluded from the study. So really trying to examine, like, why are people excluded and what are the factors that exclude people from a study? So acknowledging that there's barriers here for sites and physicians as well, but focusing primarily on the patients for today's conversation. And those items, some of them already been touched on already, but just to go through, for example, language. If you wish to make a booking, it's much more preferable to do that in your own language. If you wish to speak to somebody at the site, obviously it's always great if you can do that in your own language and at no extra cost to you to actually have to do that in a different language. Things like logistical burdens as well. It could be something like pet care, that could actually prevent someone from taking part in the study because they have pets that need looking after. If it's a overnight stay that's required, that could be a real challenge and a real burden. It could be a pediatric study. So I've worked closely on pediatric studies that require a caregiver. In some cases, it requires 2 caregivers. And if those 2 caregivers are both parents and there's a younger sibling, you now have 4 people that need to travel to the site to get the patient in for their next visit at the clinical site. So some real logistical burdens can be a huge challenge for people. For example, if someone's in a rural location, so to widen your patient population, to be able to draw on more patients from a wider space, that's then going to require further distance for them to travel to actually get to the site. So there could be some navigation challenges. We talked about an aging population a couple of moments ago. Perhaps trying to get an aging population to the site is different challenges. Maybe that's harder for them to get on that long distance journey, and they need a different solution for that. Or extensive travel. So it could be that you don't mind doing the travel, but this particular study requires extensive travel, and that means time off work. So perhaps for some people that will be a challenge for them taking that time off. That's a loss of income, as well as difficulty in actually taking time off work as well. Socioeconomic reasons is kind of related to that, I guess, with that loss of wages, but maybe people don't have the expense to actually get to the site to take part in the study, and that excludes them from being able to take part. And therefore you decrease the patient population that you could draw on, or you exclude people just because they're not able to make that out-of-pocket expense to get to the site to take part. Or it could be that they need to get to a site that requires a flight or some sort of longer distance travel that is really a big burden for somebody to pay out by themselves to get there. It could be, as I mentioned before, about caregivers. If you have 4 people traveling, you can imagine that's 4 times the cost probably of just one person traveling in some cases. And then mental and physical health. So it's again, so thinking of some of my own experiences, if people are traveling with a wheelchair and you want those people to be part of your study, perhaps they have different needs to the other patients on that study, whether you can collapse the chair into a car, whether they can travel by train, whether they need to be in the wheelchair, in the car being transported, as opposed to being able to maneuver themselves around a train station. There's so many different factors to consider. And it's quite surprising to hear from the folks that we speak to that 40% of sites struggle to enroll one patient. And that can often lead to a lot of the reasons I've just explained there as to why some of those challenges pose themselves. And what is another sort of fact to throw out with you is that 55% can drop out. So after all the effort to include these patients into the clinical trial, and as Ingrid mentioned earlier on, needing the data to actually get to the end of the study is really important. So then actually retaining those patients throughout the study. So really here trying to look at the patient's pathway and examine all the possibilities along the way that could pose themselves as barriers, and working out then what we can do to overcome those. And some industry research as well. So just to show a fact here from some research that took place to say that the expenses to participate in the clinical trial are the number one reason why patients either don't enroll or they drop out prematurely. So we did some research ourselves. So to go back to actually something more research-based that we did a survey of over 100 sites, sponsors and CROs to ask what they think the top barriers are for clinical trial participation. And you can see some common themes, not just in my few slides, but with those that Ian had talked about and Ingrid earlier on. So distance, transportation, reimbursement, lack of knowledge and understanding. So that's obviously where organisations like EUPATI are able to help as well, to get that understanding and then overcoming some of those barriers along the way. The great news, of course, is that these barriers and these kind of 3 key themes that came out of the survey that we did, these are really solvable. And we hear our clients talking about wanting to address these and looking for solutions and ways to overcome these barriers. So diversity is a topic that Greenfire is very passionate about, but it's also that our clients as sponsors that we work with that are also passionate about and looking for ways to break down some of these barriers, whether it's the expenses, the inconvenience, and just removing some of that burden and the complexity there as well. So my final slide is just to sort of talk about some of the real practical examples, perhaps, that we've seen of diversity in practice here. So these could be whether you're based in London, Warsaw, or Sydney, Australia. I'm really just talking about some of the specific examples there, whether it's, driving to the site, if that's your preference. It could be that you prefer to take a car service. That's the best means of transport for that particular patient. The accommodation, if it's an overnight stay or it's a long distance travel. You can see some of the examples on there. I talked about lost wages, child and pet care expenses. So really thinking as a solution about something that's a global coverage, but a local service. So going back to the language example earlier on, and the fact that while there's one solution, maybe there's a multitude of different approaches required, because every patient will be different with different needs. So to overcome these barriers, it's looking at global coverage. Clinical trials are global, trying to provide a local service whilst it's still a global outreach, and then also providing the flexibility of these particular options or removing these barriers at an individual patient level. That's all for me. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, Angela. This was really brilliant and absolutely interesting to listen to some of the practical aspects. And also, I'm happy to confirm that there are a couple of questions already in the questions and answers box. So we will start with those, and please keep the questions coming. If we run out of questions, then I have some more for you, which popped into my mind while listening to you, and I think that they can be quite interesting for the rest of the discussion. But let's start with the first question. First of all, one of the participants says hi, and we say hi back, and thank you very much for being with us. It's good to have you here. Now, one question is which goes to Ingrid. Do you see any solutions or any issues around GDPR versus racial and ethnicity data collection? And does that constitute a burden in the EU?
Well, the GDPR is certainly not something that makes our life in clinical research easier. I do not really think that it is an issue to diversity, larger or smaller diversity. I think it is principally a new burden for organizing the reliability of the consent of the patients to collecting their data, using their data for evaluation, and then also potentially secondary use. So I think in the context of diversity, I would not see the GDPR really as a top problem. No, it certainly does not facilitate further, because patients are nervous, much more nervous about their data and what happens with their data. So the skepticism is certainly increased since we have all these discussions about the GDPR and the benefits and what this means for patients. But I do not see, at least from my experience, I would not see that particular patient populations are more inclined to see this as a or to use this as a resistance for participation in a trial.
Thank you. The next one is, I think, best planted with Ian, because it is about public patient involvement groups and creating diversity in these groups. So it's often difficult for researchers to reach out to diverse patient groups and to recruit diverse patients or patient groups. What's your view on that? I would think that patient organizations are perhaps the first or the best place to go, but maybe there aren't patient organizations in all research and therapeutic fields. So what would be your take on that, Ian?
That's a very good question, and I would have said patient organizations were the first place to go. But as to apart from that, then I suspect that's, it would be hard to specify what I would recommend, because different things happen in different countries, and there's kind of different approaches to how scientists and medical staff interact with patients in different countries. I don't know what to recommend apart from patient organizations, really. I think certainly there's usually some kind of network within most medical disease diagnoses, I would have thought, even if it's at a local level in a particular hospital or in a care setting. So I think if a researcher was keen to involve a much more diverse selection of people in the sample, and that's the first place they would go, because there's usually some kind of support system or support mechanism for patients. If patients themselves want to be more involved in trials that are happening around in their area, then it may depend how aware they are of that, because often the trials aren't kind of advertised on the walls or on the internet or whatever. They're usually privately recruited by researchers or clinical staff. So in those kind of situations, it's much harder. I mean, usually, certainly in the UK and many EU countries, I think there is a central database of trials that are taking place within a country, certainly the country level. And I think in the EU, there's one at the EU level as well. And therefore, if patients or patient groups are very keen to find out, well, what's happening about the condition I have in my area, then that may be a useful resource as well. I'm not sure if that helps. It's a very vague answer. I'm sorry. Maybe Ingrid or Angela may be able to add something to that.
I think it is very much dependent on the area of indication, and we need to be clear that an interest, a proactive interest of patients to participate in a clinical trial is, of course, much bigger in areas of indications where there is no alternative treatment or where the patients are severely sick. But a lot of studies are performed in not so dangerous areas of indications and where we have a lot of treatment alternatives already. And there, the proactive interest of patients to participate in a trial are much, much less expressed. So I think we really have to distinguish between areas of indications where there is this proactive interest of patients to find a study and to want to participate, and the many other trials where we have desperate needs, and I think Angela knows about that really well, to find patients who are willing to donate their health and disease status and time to research. And there it's really much more a pull and not a proactive initiative from the patient side.
Yes, I'd agree. We certainly get a lot of feedback from our clients and sponsors who are trying to reach out to those patients and trying to, again, we kind of look at it through that lens of the barriers as to what might limit them from being able to take part, which I think is a really great way of looking at it, and then and it's accepting that there's probably not one answer, right? That there's various different ways of addressing it, and you'll probably have to have several different approaches to actually increase those numbers of diverse populations.
The next question actually also goes to you, Angela, because it is about universities using vouchers to pay patients or to give compensation to patients. And the impression of the participant is that this is not very inclusive and does not necessarily cover real costs. Have you ever tried to talk to universities to convince them to do otherwise, or do you have any experience with this?
Yes, so it's definitely something that we're trying to do a lot more of, is to, work with individual universities or sites. Everyone has a different method of reimbursement, and whether that is more led by reimbursement based. So we see an awful lot of that. So it's based specifically on the reimbursement, and, we're able to do that. But there's also the opportunity there for different types of reimbursements as well. So vouchers is a common way of doing it, and something that we're finding is increasingly inflexible. So an opportunity to provide a more flexible approach. So it could be, for example, we talked about childcare, but even just for the travel expense. So perhaps the voucher doesn't cover the travel expense. If I've come from a further afield, then maybe I would require or be looking for a larger reimbursement than somebody who has taken the bus from somewhere more locally. So it's really having a means and the view of what that patient has done to get there. So we do work quite closely with some universities to try to help assist with those reimbursements, making it a flexible. I think I feel like I'm using that word a lot, but I really feel that is really important, to give different options for different patients depending on their circumstances.
Right, so it's not entirely impossible, is what you're saying. That it's something that's being considered and also has to be considered as you move forward with facilitating a clinical trial. The next one, I know your background in regulatory affairs and the systems, how systems work in Europe, Ingrid. This I think is best placed with you. Is it possible to consider a clinical trial in a European country, knowing that there are different regulations for a given drug in different EU countries?
Well, first of all, we have fortunately harmonized system for performing clinical trials from an authorization point of view, from an ethical review point of view, from an pharmacovigilance or safety overview point of view. And we have lots and lots of guidelines on the European level on how to develop new treatments in particular areas of indications. Of course, we can perform clinical trials in every country in Europe. There is absolutely no reason why not, but they all have the same fundamental requirements concerning competent authority, ethical approval, and let's say ethical and methodological requirements as well.
Thank you. The next one is
I can mention one thing, which is
yes.
really a problem here, and this is that what is problematic and is really a topic in the diversity area. This is that we have a very big need, but very big hurdles for cross-border access to clinical trials. So patients who want to participate in a trial in another country because in their own country this trial is not taking place. And there we have, again, a huge amount of hurdles from the language perspective, from the reimbursement perspective, from the travel costs and logistics perspective. And especially in rare diseases, this is really a very frequent need for patients, and we have no preparation for that in Europe whatsoever.
Thank you. So we have 3 minutes left, so let's give just a rapid fire answer to this. Do you see any contradiction based on this question between advocating for more diversity in phase 3 and later phase clinical trials and the safety issues that may arise if you include a more diverse population upfront from earlier stages on?
Is that a question to me?
I guess, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, anyone can, yes.
Yeah, I really think, yes, we should really try to enable as much diversity as possible, but also as much as possible, as much as makes sense. Because if we just put a huge of efforts into getting everybody in a clinical trial, we may end up with no positive result and then have a delay of the access to that treatment for many more patients. So I think it really requires this very detailed, intelligent thinking with the input from the patients. And for this, I make a big plea because they have a very important voice here, that we enable that, but that we may find the right balance between logistics and difficulties of bringing patients in and also methodological aspects and the need to come to new treatments as quickly as possible.
I would agree with that. Thanks, Ingrid. Sorry, can I just jump in here very briefly? Yes, yeah. I would agree. And I think there's a strong case for adding sub-studies into maybe phase 4 parts of the trial, because at least if you're including people in trials who may or may not have a side effect, which is something that needs flagging, at least they're having that side effect, whatever it is, in a very highly monitored situation as a clinical trial, rather than down the line somewhere in a hospital in some part of rural somewhere or something. So yeah. That's another thing to weigh up.
But I think we really should include the phase 4, so the trials after marketing authorization, more systematically into our overall thinking and planning. And by knowing that these trials will come, we see that now in COVID-19, there is a lot of this discussion of when to include pregnant women into a vaccination trial, and also when to include children into a pediatric trial with vaccination. So by having a clear plan for that on the pharma company side and communicating this very transparently and clearly to the population that this will be a stepwise approach and why it is so important to have the drug authorized now as quickly as possible, to have more flexibilities than for the other activities. That, I think, is a matter of communication that can really create an understanding of the population for the needs that we have as clinical researchers to do such a stepwise approach, and that ultimately this is in the benefit of the patients at large.
Thank you very much. We have two more questions which we unfortunately have no more time to answer. So we will get back to you by email and respond to your questions by email. Which, I mean, both of these questions are super interesting, but I think we can just as well answer them in writing. Thank you very much, especially to our panelists, speakers today, and a huge thank you to Greenfire and also to EUPATI for organizing this session, and certainly to all the participants who gave us this hour and listened to us. And we're looking forward to hearing back from you after this session. You will certainly receive a link to the recording, so you can rewatch the recording and still come back to us with your questions. Thank you. Have a good rest of the day, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.